welcome to everybody, especially anybody who's new to water. This is a special welcome, of course, to the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, who will discuss her book with us very shortly. I begin, as I always do, with a land acknowledgement, hoping that you will think of the land upon which you sit as well. We at Water are on indigenous land in Silver Spring, Maryland, the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. We acknowledge their trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. We affirm the right of all persons to bring their whole selves and their stories into this space. And that's the work of Water, to bring feminist, womanist, spiritual values to efforts at social change. And today's book under discussion, In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit, is a prime example of womanist wisdom for everyone. So our format, per usual, will be my introduction of the speaker, who will have then 20 or 25 minutes to lay out the contours of this work and other issues that she might wish to raise with us. There'll then be plenty of time for dialogue, questions, discussion. So please listen and enjoy. We take notes, so they'll be on our website shortly after Dr. Pierce has had a quick look at them for accuracy. I would never want to put words in someone's mouth. But we'll put them up on our website along with the video of this so that you can watch it again, you can share it with your friends, you can use it in your own teaching and research. And I hope that you will socialize this resource in your networks and tell people about what I think you'll agree with me by the end of the hour. It's a very important new book. For now, I ask you to please mute your audio to cut down on noise. And when our speaker finishes, you'll be more than able to join the conversation. We'll end at 2 at the top of the hour, and I hope after that people will stay on if they wish to have a little bit of informal conversation, but the main point is that we will work until 2 our time here on the East Coast, Eastern Daylight Time. So with deep gratitude to the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, I will introduce her and welcome her one more time in the warmest way possible here at Water. She's a neighbor who lives here in what we call the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, where she's the Dean of Howard University Divinity School as well as a professor. She is the first woman to be named Dean of the Howard University School of Divinity, which is in Washington, DC, and is a very highly regarded divinity school. In the panoply of divinity schools around the world, Howard University has its own place. She was the founding director of the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And that means she probably can get us tickets, but I'm not going to guarantee that. That's one of the hardest tickets to get in Washington, and it is one of the most phenomenal places that I have ever been. It's the, I want to repeat it, the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall. It is a treasure trove of history and contemporary notions and ideas and artifacts and honorings of the African American contributions to this country. And her work with religious life at that museum is something that I didn't know about before, but now I'm going to go back and look again and see what you chose and why you chose it. And just remembering, I had the opportunity to go there when the Society for Christian Ethics was here in town, and it was a wonderful experience to take a number of colleagues in the field, including the great professor at Harvard, Preston Williams, and his wife Connie, and they led our delegation into the museum, and they certainly could be featured there as well. She was also the director of the Center for Black Church Studies and associate professor of religion and literature at Princeton Theological Seminary for 9 years. She received her undergraduate degree at Princeton and her master's and doctorate at Cornell. And I have to say, as I read the book and the references to snow falling outside the library, I could picture you in Ithaca. I think that's probably where those experiences happened. Dr. Pierce specializes in African American religious history, in Womanist Theology, African American literature, and race and religion. She has published widely, including a book called Hell Without Fires, Slavery, Christianity, and the African American Spiritual Narrative, published in 2021 by the University of Florida. She's working on a book, as I understand it, Religious Ecstasy and African American Cultural Expression, which focuses on the historical and contemporary significance of the African American religious tradition. Dr. Pierce comes to us from a Pentecostal background. She's an ordained Christian minister, And like many of us in water circles, she says, and I quote, that she works tirelessly to bridge the gaps between pulpit, pew, and academy. Very much a water kind of person. And in her book, In My Grandmother's House, I had my first acquaintance with her work. But when I read it, I knew that it was a book for a broad audience, one that I wanted to promote. And here's what we said about it in the Water book blurbs. You know, we have that little section on our website that says what we're reading. And we pick from the many, many, many books that we get. We pick just about a dozen every 2 or 3 months. And we blurb them. And we said about this book, this is Womanist Theology, written elegantly for all to read and understand. It's a labor of love for the author's grandmother, her descendants, and those in the wider world who need the deep faith and savvy insights so many ancestors share. The touch is light, the impact deep, a smart and compelling read. That's how I experienced this book. But when I reread it for today's discussion, I marveled further at how beautifully it's crafted into 12 chapters that move from the life of Yolanda's grandmother and the life of the brilliant attorney and Episcopal priest Paulie Murray that many of us talked about last week with Kelly Brown Douglas, to a closing chapter that you were sent when you registered that also appeared as an article in the Christian Century, Power in Naming. I could almost see your grandmother's house by the time I finished reading this for the second time. And when I read the afterword by a daughter, I had to read it again to be sure I got the authorship of that particular piece correct. I won't give it away. It's such a touching and compelling summary of the whole book that only someone very close to it could have written it. I will invite Dr. Pierce to fill in the rest, but as I welcome you, and if I may, I'll call you Yolanda, I hope you'll feel at home here as you have made us feel at home among your ancestors, whose wisdom reverberates and whose struggles continue. I only hope that they know the degree to which you have honored them by sharing stories we inherit. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
We look forward with great anticipation to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so kind. Just really, really beautiful. And thank you all for welcoming me here. I'm going to share my screen. It's just really a privilege and a joy to have the conversation with you all and to talk a little bit about how I got here with this particular work, and also to just have this conversation, to hear feedback, hear your thoughts, hear your questions. So it is wonderful, wonderful to share the afternoon with you all. So this is In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. I started off with really, for me, a simple question, but it's usually the simple questions that actually lead us somewhere. And years of doing this work, I've been in theological education now for a total of 15 years. I spent almost 10 years at Princeton. I have been here at Howard School of Divinity for 4 years, and trained, as I'm sure some of you all are as well, in theology, feminist and womanist theologies. And one of the things that really struck me, particularly when I was thinking about my academic writing, is about how the people who are most influential in the faith are often not represented in the people who write the theology. And that, it's simple, but it was a revelation to me that as I had grown up in a Christian household and was now doing theology primarily for Christian communities, as I read in graduate school, the great theologians, the ones that everyone reads, then read some contemporary ones. And I was like, all of these folks I'm reading about, and yet the person who taught me my own faith, right, is somehow not represented here. And that was my grandmother. And so then I asked the question, what if my grandmother was the greatest theologian I have ever known? It was to, I think, stop and pause for a moment to make the suggestion about, yes, who can do theology, but also really to sit with how, in fact, the traditions, which many of us inherited, how we learned them. And I learned faith, belief at the feet of my grandmother. that one of my earliest memories is actually my grandmother kneeling with me at the foot of my tiny twin bed. It was like 5 years old, I don't know, however, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and teaching me the Lord's Prayer. And then I started thinking about all of those women in my tradition, from the church mothers, my grandmother, who were teaching me the faith. But when I read the formal theology in the academy, and even as a person writing theology in the academy, somehow they weren't present. So this is how this project began. Of course, I'm influenced, as some of you may be familiar with the verse from 2 Timothy 1:5. I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois, your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. And all I could think about is, wow, what manner of faith is this, that the person recalling it doesn't just recall that person's faith, but their mother's faith and then another generation's faith. So I simply wanted to do a few things. This question asks, what is womanist theology? I know you all know, so I don't have to go into how it got here and what happened, but the three pieces that I just simply wanted to lift up was the reminder for me as a scholar that theology, womanist theology, is a theology of critique and protest. That's important because as it emerges, first formally in the academy, and now I think it just lives and moves and breathes in multiple spaces, that it emerges as a critique to the theologies that had excluded Black women, as a protest for the silence and the absence. And so part of what I'm interested in is silences and absences. Secondly, about womanist theology, really taking seriously the Imago Dei, the made in the image and the likeness of God, the created uniquely and beautifully in the image and likeness of God. But this was the piece that I really wanted to offer, which is that if womanist theology is to be in its full flowering, it has to, in fact, do what I'm calling grandmother theology. And that is about generational work, right? Work across the generations. Like someone, I think when I was actually touring with the book and going to different cities, like, oh, why not a mother? And it isn't that mother's theology isn't in here, but the reason that I'm talking about a grandmother's theology is because I'm interested in cross-generational conversations and the wisdom that comes from the elders, and a particular place that I think elders hold in community. And so this grandmother theology is not just about biological grandmothers. I want to be very, very clear. It is about other mothers, other influences, elders, mentors, friends who come into community with us and bring their generational wisdom. So let me just share quickly the four things that I've been thinking about and that I'm hoping this kind of work, not just this book, but other work that I've done is doing. And the first is this: thinking about theological source material. This is so incredibly important. What's the source material for doing theological work? If you come from a tradition, a sola scriptura tradition, then many people would argue that the source material for doing theological work are only the sacred texts, the biblical texts. But I really want to challenge us to think beyond sacred texts, biblical texts, and even the texts that come and emerge out of our traditions from catechisms and what have you, to say, what are non-biblical source materials for understanding how God moves in the world, and particularly here in the lives of Black women? And that source material is poetry and literature. That source material is cooking and quilting. That source material is the everyday quotidian life of doing the laundry and caring for children, so that we really have a fuller picture of the source material for theological work. So as I was watching the women around me, I was watching how their faith lived in such harmony with everything that was happening in their lives. lives, that this wasn't just about the scripture text. It wasn't only about the hymns and the songs and the gospel music, which is so rich in my childhood, but it was literally about how my grandmother understood God operating in the kitchen, right? And one of the things that I describe, because it happened so often, is that I would go as a kid, look in the refrigerator, and I'm like, oh, there's nothing to eat in here, right? And just walk away and look again, nothing had changed, and oh, there's nothing to eat in here. But my grandmother would go into that same kitchen and look in that same refrigerator. And hours later, there would be a feast, right? Hours later, there would be food for family and those gathered with us, right? And for me, once I got to graduate school and I was introduced to the notion of a God who creates from nothing, I was prepared for it because I had watched a woman go into a kitchen, create something from nothing. I'd watched her sew scraps of fabric into beautiful quilts. So what are the source materials that we have for doing theological work and theological reflection, particularly for those who are located out of these academic spaces? My second point was to think about spiritual lineage and inheritance, the legacy that I think we want to leave for the next generation, but also who do we number among our great cloud of witnesses? Of course, here I'm, signifying on chapter in the Bible in Hebrews that talks about the great cloud of witnesses and call it, the Hall of Fame, the biblical Hall of Fame. But we all have a cloud of witnesses. We all have people, ancestors, forebears, dear friends who've come before us and make up that cloud of witnesses, who make up for us our spiritual lineage. This is necessary to me because when I think in particular about being a person who is a descendant of enslaved people, right? The family lineage, right? The bloodlines get interrupted because of chattel slavery in this nation. And so you can only go back so far in terms of doing this kind of genealogical work. So I'm really invested in something other than genealogical work, which is spiritual lineage. If you are Hindu, you think about many Hindus, they can name the gurus and they name their guru and it takes them back generations and generations. That's not their bloodline, that's their spiritual lineage. And so I then started thinking about all of these folks that I had in my spiritual lineage who are part of this great cloud of witnesses. And I think what that allowed for me in particular was to be able to claim strength from the ancestors who may or may not be my own, right? And so this is the Sojourner Truth, and this is the Harriet Tubman, and to claim them as my own, even if I may or may not, I don't know, who knows, be related to them. And so I'm thinking about that spiritual lineage, and I'm also thinking about that spiritual inheritance. So my background in terms of my church tradition is Pentecostal, and we had an official church office, which is the church mother. We had a mother's board, and these individuals were known as church mothers. This was actual church office. And so I think about these mothers, and we would call them Mother something, Mother Johnson, Mother Jackson, Mother Pearson, my grandmother's name. And I think about these women and calling them mother, right? The way in which you may call a priest father or mother. That's about spiritual lineage. And I'm a product of that. And I wanted to really celebrate that lineage. The third thing I was hoping to do was to complicate power and agency, particularly for African-American women in the Christian church, to actually name the paradox of power. And the paradox of power, of course, is this. Something like 85 to 90% of the membership of African-American Christian churches are women, but less than 15% of the leadership are African-American women. So Black women are among the most faithful, the most religious, the most devout, the most likely to give, to serve, to every index that, say, someone like Pew uses to say, how religious are people. By every measurable index, Black women are among the most religious. And yet they are in very, very tiny numbers in terms of actual leadership. The paradox of power, though, is this. These women in my childhood denomination, large numbers of them, something like 85 to 90%, who could not be pastors because my denomination didn't allow for women to be ordained. These women still wielded all of the power in this church. And so it's the paradox of power. I learned very early on that simply because someone's name was on the outside of a building, or simply because there was an individual, usually a man, at the mic on Sunday mornings at 11, that actually wasn't the person who held the most power. And so this mother's board, if they said no, the answer was no. And if they said yes, the answer was yes. I watched them wield authority. And so I'm really just wrestling with this paradox of power. And the second corollary to that is, then where do we locate these sites of power and agency for Black women in religious spaces? And certainly for me, now ordained, but thinking about that, of course, as a site of power and agency for me, but also thinking about other places in religious spaces where Black women have had authority, have had power, have wrestled with the patriarchy, and are in a certain respect just like revered for not just their wisdom, but in fact, they can shift and change something very, very quickly. So these paradoxes of power are still with us. The imbalance of power is still here. The existence of the patriarchy is certainly ever present. And yet, how have women always been able to undermine that in ways big and small? I think here about the great Dolores Williams in her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, where she talks about what womanist work is about the art of cunning. So, which is to say, even if your name isn't on the building, that doesn't mean that you don't have the kind of cunning and ability to be able to shift the discourse. And then survival and thriving. Maybe perhaps what I learned most in my grandmother's house, raised by my grandparents, was about survival and thriving, how faith provided for this generation of women, and this generation in terms of my grandparents, most of whom were born in the rural South. After the Second World War, the second great migration of African Americans from the rural South to places like New York or Philadelphia or Chicago or wherever they went, many of them actually fleeing the terror of the South, fleeing lynchings, fleeing violence, and looking for a better way, a better life in the North. Sometimes they found it, and sometimes they did not. But these women, like my grandmother, had been born and raised on a former cotton plantation. My grandfather, who was from North Carolina, whose parents and grandparents were sharecroppers on a tobacco farm in North Carolina. Like how these folks brought with them this faith and used that faith to survive. My grandmother, born in the early 1930s. So this quote to me from Audre Lorde really seemed applicable. She says, I have a real respect for survival. By survival, I do not mean mere existence, which is the province of the walking wounded and the walking dead, but an active quality of living. Survival is the ability to consciously draw one breath after another, to move, to teach, to find both the power and the joy relative to our lives. Survival means living with focus. And I use this particular imagery. It's from the collection that we have at NAMAC, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, because it is an image of joy. And And so on one hand, a story that is about forced migration from the South, that is often about terror and violence, stories that could not even be told. And one of the things I alluded to in the book about a particular church mother was that I never heard her backstory, but there was a lot of pain in her face, right? And somehow these men and women found a way to not merely survive, right? Like, oh, we've survived, but literally to thrive, to find spaces of joy. And for many of them, the space of joy was in that church. This is where, as a good scholar, I remind folks that it isn't until the middle of the 20th century, not 19th, the middle of the 20th century, that 85% of Black women were employed in domestic work, which is my grandmother's story. She was a domestic worker my entire life. And so I think about the material conditions under which so many of these women lived. And then I think about how they managed not only to survive, but to find joy, to find a sense of peace, to find a love for God, and then to teach another generation that love. So I just want to end on this note because I had mentioned Dolores Williams, and she informs my work across so many different ways. But she wrote in Sisters in the Wilderness that faith has taught me to see the miraculous in everyday life, the miracle of ordinary Black women resisting and rising above evil forces, what she calls the demonarchy, for those of you who know her work, evil forces in society, where forces work to destroy and subvert the creative power and energy my mother and grandmother taught me that God gave Black women. I hope what I've done is to really honor ordinary Black women. A lot of times the literature, whether it's biblical or fictional, it really focuses on the famous people, right? The way we tell the story of our faith is really the story of the heroes. The way in which we do so much of our kind of popular culture, it's about the winners, the big names. I had the distinct privilege actually to be at the White House last week, where I attended the ceremony honoring the brand new Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Jackson. And surely books will be written and short stories and kids' books and about Judge Jackson, and worthy she is of them. But there are ordinary women. And my grandmother, beloved to me, was an ordinary woman, no formal education, had attended school about the 6th, 7th grade level before leaving the South. No one would recognize her name. And I was surrounded by these ordinary women, but extraordinary to me because of their capacity to love, because of their faithfulness, because of their willingness to engage and to teach and to train. It didn't mean, I think, and I want to be very clear, that it wasn't always easy. Definitely in my childhood background was the legalism that came along with the faith. Legalism is probably the best word. The restrictions that seemed unnecessary. The don't do this, don't do that, don't go here, don't wear that. It was just constantly being reinforced. And I struggled against it and I fought against it. But with some wisdom and some understanding, and especially I think with some grace, this is why I'm interested in the generational conversation. I know some things now that I didn't know then. There are still some things I have some questions about, but grace is really the operative word here, that they showed me a lot of grace through my wilderness and teenage years. And I'm trying to exercise a lot of grace and thinking back about how I was raised and the conditions under which I was raised. But I think Dolores Williams has it right. In a world struggling to sort of subvert these forces, these powers, that they had this creativity, this energy, this joy that taught me to love God. And even in seasons of doubt or despair, I hold on to what they taught me, and it has carried me a long way. So this is in my grandmother's house. So thank you so much for listening so attentively. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully we get to have a conversation. Okay. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Thank you so very, very much. The Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, for those who might have joined a little bit later, the dean, the first woman dean, I might add, of Howard University Divinity School. And the dean is what is, in fact, the president. That's the person in charge. So I don't want you to think that this is just somebody who's pushing a little paper. This is somebody who's actually running the institution. And I can see from your presentation and from this book how much we have to learn from and with you. And I'm just delighted that this is your first experience of water, and I hope it will not be your last.
Look forward to being with you all again. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great to have you, and I'm delighted that you're. I don't know where you are in the DMV, but we're in Silver Spring, so
right here in Northwest DC, right here.
All right, we're not far. Great. So the book, as has been mentioned, is In My Grandmother's House: Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. It is a publication of Broadleaf Books, which is an imprint of 1517 Media, and it really is, in my view, everything that Dr. Pierce has laid out and more. I think she's been unduly modest in terms of both how beautifully written it is and how well crafted in terms of how the story comes together in these 12 chapters and how you just want more. So with that, I will open the conversation. If you would like to make a comment, ask a question, offer a reflection, I ask you only to be brief. We used to say, be brief, be witty, be seated. Those were the 3 B's of how to give a good presentation. Be brief, be witty, and be seated. So actually, that you can find that. I wrote that essay. It's on the American Academy of Religion website to tell people how to give a presentation. So the 3 B's: be brief, be witty, and be seated. The floor is open. All you need to do is go to the bottom right-hand corner where it says reactions. Press that little button. It will allow you to raise your hand. You can see mine is now up, and when you're finished, you can go right back there and lower your hand. If that's more technology than you want to cope with, you can always raise your hand in the old-fashioned way, and I'll be looking for those people. And especially if it's a predominantly Catholic group, I always say you could use the old Catholic school approach. Stir, stir, stir. Remember you said sister. That was it. You meant sister, but it was stir is all you got out because you really absolutely had the answer and had to be the first one and show off. But I never did that, so I've only seen it done. But it's another way you could get attention. Anna Coop from the Loretto community will be first, and then Jeanette Stokes from the Resource Center of Women in Ministry in the South will be second. So Anna Coop, it's yours. Be sure to unmute.
So Yolanda,
with our deep thanks to Yolanda Pierce. Go ahead, Anna Coop, unmute, please.
I was just going to say thank you so much, Yolanda, for this kind of focus in your book. The expression, the art of cunning, truly caught my ears, my heart. And I wonder if you could give some experience of yours on the use of the art of cunning.
I love that. And I also love that expression. So I come from a Pentecostal, Pentecostal holiness background. These were very, very deeply conservative places, as you can well imagine, particularly around the area of gender. And this actually happened to me since I've been here in Washington, D.C., which is an interesting story. I was asked to come and speak and say a few words on behalf of the school, and happy to go do that. And I get there, and the pastor sees me, and I'm sitting there, and he says, so, thank you so much for being here. I just want you to know that we don't allow women in the pulpit, and so you're going to have to bring your remarks from the floor. And I was like, and so I'm there, I'm, all dressed up. I mean, this is work. This is it. And I was like, oh, okay, this is, wow, what year is this? Like, like you sort of wanted to say, like, are we still doing this? Like, are we still having these conversations? Are we still doing, and so I said, oh, you have two choices at that moment. You can say, no, thank you, and leave, right? Or you can say, okay, and do the best that you can. And trust me, I went back and forth for a very long time. What it caused me to do, and this is the art of cunning, was to sort of completely change my remarks on the fly. I had just enough time to jot down a few notes to myself so that when I did get to the mic on the floor, then my whole entire remarks and reflections were about Sojourner Truth speaking from the floor of a local building in New York, and what she did from the floor, and about how women on the floor, and so it wouldn't have come up. Those weren't the remarks I would have given. I would have just given kind of very like, oh, so nice to be here with you all today, and let me tell you about the school and blah, 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 right? But then all of a sudden it actually turned into, well, if I am here, I'm going to give you a brief history about what women have done from these spaces. So you make choices, and no, the choice to leave would have been a right choice, but the choice to stay and say, this is a moment to be cunning and to be wise. So I love that from Dolores Williams. And I think she really captures what women, particularly women who are in ministry, who have vocational calls, often have to do. It's not deception. This is saying we have to be artistic, wily. I love that in American Indian traditions, right? The fox, the animals who sort of embody what do you have to do in order to accomplish your goal. And so that was just one example, but thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer. And it sounds like some people would say that you wiped the floor, as it were, with these persons who would have you.
They haven't invited me back, but that's okay. It's all, I said what I had to say.
We've all been thrown out of better places. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Good for you. Yeah, and I love the fact that you're referring us time and again to Dolores Williams. Dolores Williams, as for those who haven't read her, Sisters in the Wilderness, was one of the great womanist theologians, well, the beginning, really, one of the earliest and greatest womanist theologians. She taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York for many years, and has been retired for a number of years. And so she's not in the public arena at this point, but her impact, both through that book and other things that she has written, will not be equaled, I don't think, for quite some while. So,
no, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mary, if I can interject here before Jeanette speaks, Dolores Williams gave some of the early water programs. And we're going to be celebrating 40 years coming up, and Dolores Williams was with us in the 80s, sharing her wisdom.
So part of why I love to refer to her is because we are now is what is being considered the third generation of womanist theologians, sort of my generation. And so she's the beginning. She's a grandmother, and literally that kind of terminology when we think about sort of the generations, and her work was just so pivotal. So that I love her connection here with you all as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeanette.
Thank you so much for being here today, Dolores. I'm Jeanette Stokes, and I run the Resource Center for Women and Ministry in the South in Durham, North Carolina. If we work at it, we may be able to find out if we're related. My Presbyterian ancestors were from North Carolina, though I grew up in Oklahoma. Just a couple of comments about your wonderful remarks. Isn't Mary Diane, isn't Dolores Williams the person who at the Reimagining Conference was quoted by the New York Times as saying, we don't need any more people hanging on crosses and bleeding? She was offering early on in feminist theology. You can find it online in the New York Times if I'm right, Mary.
Yeah, you are right, and it had to do with what was referred to as surrogacy in a certain way.
Right. She was offering a new version of atonement theory.
Yep.
But
she was vilified for it, as was the conference.
Yes,
she herself
really got quoted for that much. So I always love when people lift her up. My own grandmother made me a minister. She never would have imagined that I would have that as a job, a Presbyterian minister, but she, like you, was the person who made me sit at her knee and memorize the children's catechism and things like that. So I just love the way that you lift up the grandmother. And I don't know if you have heard this story from Danielle McCrae, who is on the homiletics faculty at Yale now. She's writing a book about Paulie Murray and tells the story. I heard her speak in a lecture about Paulie Murray's grandmother. So Paulie Murray's grandmother was a farm wife, basically, in Durham, and her house is now preserved. Paulie grew up there because her own parents died. But Dr. McCrae quotes Paulie Murray's grandmother as a source for Paulie Murray's style of preaching. And what her grandmother did was to get mad at the neighbors when they would let their cow into her garden. And she would pick up a garden implement, start humming a hymn, and walk towards the neighbor's house, not leaving her own property, and start quoting scripture and yelling at the neighbors about letting their cow or their dog into her garden. And that use of scripture and tradition and one's own experience and energy, Dr. McCrae cites as a source of Paulie Murray's own preaching. And I love that you cite alternative sources, not just scripture, tradition, community, and experience, but other sources as well. So I just would love to hear you say a little bit more about sources for theology, or for doing theology, or for preaching.
I love that. So Paulie Murray, of course, has a Howard connection because she went to law school here. And so where we are on campus, it's Howard's campus is called West Campus. And so it's the Divinity School, the Law School, and the School of Social Work. The three professional schools share a campus. And so every day I literally see Paulie Murray as I come in. We have a Paulie Murray conference room and her portrait. So, so a wonderful, wonderful connection. So source material. It's almost as if I say to my students sometimes that what I think we often lack as a nation, as a community, is divine imagination. And I use that term divine imagination a lot because I said, we don't lack resources or tools, or we lack the will, we lack the imagination. And so when I'm thinking about source material, I'm thinking about how are other ways that theologians and those who write theology can talk about, describe God. What else are they pulling from? What else do they have access to, right? It's the way in which my frustration with the folks who can only call God Father is because it's not only that. There's nothing wrong with Father. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it's to say that you're not imaginative enough when there are hundreds of names, right? When there's so much more that fills in the gaps. It is rich. And so for me, when I think about source material, are we doing work with ecology? Right? Are we doing work with our environment? Are we thinking about the stuff that we do, material, the art, the music, the song, the dance, the rhythm? And so having grown up in a very bodily tradition, it's like those expressions are holy. So I'm just pressing the theologians to say there are all kinds of source material for the way that we do this work. And when we expand that, then we actually become more inclusive. More people have a stake in a theological project because they see themselves and their lives represented there. Again, my students are here getting MDivs, getting PhDs. They read all of it, the Barts and the Calvins and the Niebers and James Conan. That's wonderful, but that's not the only way you can do theology. And I think women, and particularly womanist and feminist scholars, have always been interested in other spaces, alternative spaces, knowing how narrow, right, a lot of those other schools of thought, which have been often very exclusive. Class, race, gender, sexual orientation, you name it, have often been very, very exclusive. So I'm just all about divine imagination. Where do we locate God, and where do we locate language about God? It's so much bigger than the very narrow ways that we've traditionally done that.
Thank you, Jeanette, for the question, and thank you, Yolanda, for the answer. Just to say, Jeanette Stokes has been on the board, if I'm not mistaken, of the Paulie Murray House in North Carolina, and it was in the chapel at the Howard University Divinity School where the play that
Yes.
was performed a couple of years ago took place, and so that's linking you two.
Yes.
Let's move on. We've got Mary Yelanik, and then we've got Sheila Curran. Mary first.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was so moving, just so moving, very powerful, as was your article.
Thank you.
And so thank you for sharing those with me. You've given us so much. When you were talking about the art of cunning, I thought about the flip side of that, which is the art of conning. And I think so many men who usurp this power, who say, these are the channels through which you must walk in order to get from here to there. It's the grand con. It's what's happening politically. It's what's happening in our religions. So I think that's the flip side.
Absolutely.
And then to tie it all together, the phrase you used, what inheritance will you leave to the next generation? These con men are leaving us with a horrific heap of crap to deal with, both in our churches and both in our political systems, in our educational systems. Thank you for speaking out and for making clear that this is not a viable way to proceed as a civilization. So thank you.
No, thank you. That's just so perfect. You're absolutely right. They are unfortunately leaving legacies that will live with us forever. We're in the brink of nuclear war. Like it's 2022. We're in the brink of nuclear war. So almost every day you get up and you read something and you think that this is the world that they will leave their children and grandchildren if it exists. How are things dying? They're leaving a dead and dying world. And so to think that there is another way. And so, thank you so much, because it's so relevant for us right now, especially here in DC. Those of us here in the DMV, we really feel it's in the air. It's in the air. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. And don't miss the chat where Rosemary Ganley has suggested that you should be taking a tour of the Caribbean area, the West Indies, and she knows she knows that area very well, and so I think she's going to send you on a bit of a tour there.
Thanks, love to.
Yeah, she's right. The resonance of your work is many places. Sheila Curran next, and then Elena.
Well, thank you, Yolanda. I'm in Ireland, and it was just so stimulating to listen to you, to hear you speak after reading your article. And indeed, I have ordered the book because your resonance is so similar to my experience of working in Peru and Latin America, where the lived lives of people on the ground is what forms their theology, because that theology is that it's the experience first, and then the theologian to use theology to interpret. And I couldn't help but think when you said, we lack divine imagination, like coming to this Easter period in the Christian tradition and remembering that the witnessing of that resurrected moment was women, and it was women who were there because of their lived life experience and their ability to stay in that experience and not run away. Mm-hmm. And it was the forming of the early Christian community's experience was because the women bankrolled it most of the time. It was the women who kept it alive until the men destroyed it in ways. But I think we forget that, and we don't use that to foster what is the inheritance we want to ensure is left. And those of us that are in traditions of Christianity that are blocked out by male domination, we have to really fight to ensure that is valued and allow those experiences of women to be raised up, because I think you're right, both in academia, but even outside academia, that women's voices get silent and women's experiences don't get honored, and their creativity dismissed, despite all the work of many women in trying to make it known, because a lot of our theologians in the Catholic tradition have been silenced because of the way they wanted to make it happen. So I just think there's so much synergy, and that synergy needs that energy is so good and refreshing. And I especially think it's beautiful to hear it in these holiest of days in the Christian tradition, to really recoup and remember and stand on those voices as well, to bring them together with the voices you mentioned and many others throughout the world who witness with divine imagination to create a very different world. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. And the beautiful reminders about Holy Week. And as we are in the thick of it right now, and thank you. This is so beautiful. I'm back to the idea about like ordinary women, and in a certain sense, right? That the women who attended to Jesus, the women who loved Jesus, the women around Jesus, just ordinary women, just working and doing and serving and loving and anointing him. And I just think about how many stories we don't know because no one thought these women's stories were important enough to record. What miracles do we not even know about because no one thought, oh, that involved a group of women, right? Like what extraordinary works happen that just the historical record, the biblical record doesn't bear, because it's just a bunch of women. And so that's where I use my divine imagination to fill in, because there's more to the story than we could ever possibly know, in large part because some people just didn't think they were important enough, right? And so I just thank you so much for the poignant reminder about what's happening in Holy Week.
Thank you both. Elena, I don't see you at the moment.
She said she left a note in the
Okay.
chat.
A little note there in the.
Oh,
in the
okay.
chat.
I will sneak in a quick question, and that is, one of the things that really caught my attention most in your book, and many things. I say I'm going back for my third read, so don't anybody try to borrow this off my desk until I have had my third read. But one of the things that caught my attention, you alluded to it in your remarks. You said that your sense of rules and regulations, the way in which things were kind of imposed upon you, was something you, like many of us, I think, rebelled against. And I remember in your writing, you talked about down to a head covering that you were asked to wear in church, and how long your skirt could be, and what you could wear, what you couldn't wear, and sleeveless, I'm sure, and things like that. And it resonated with me coming from the Catholic tradition, because we have a very quantitative approach to ethics. If your skirt isn't so many inches from, I don't know where it's supposed to be these days, but it's very quantitative. It's not a qualitative ethic, it's very quantitative ethic. So I resonated with that. But what you said in the book really caught my attention, and I don't know whether I'm just getting old or whether you really have a very important insight here, which I think is really significant. And that is, you said that the reasons for these kinds of rules in your community, and I never thought about this in mine, but it might be true, were not so much for reasons of purity and sexism, although those were certainly a piece of it, but it was to put other people on notice. And you didn't use the term, but I'm going to say, especially certain young gentlemen, that these young women who are in this community are cared for and watched out for by other members of the community, and those who might presume upon them in any way better watch out, because they are being watched by these elders. And I thought that was so, I never imagined how that might work. And you really said something there that I think others on the call would love to hear you reflect more about.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Really a profound insight, I thought.
No, I think you've got it exactly right. And that's why I said that's why this stage in my life is really about grace. I thought it was just ridiculous growing up, right? The skirt, and it has to be this, and right, sleeveless, and we wore doilies on our head. I'm like, I'm 14. What the heck is this? It just didn't even make any sense. It just made absolutely no sense. But here's what I know.
We call them chapel veils.
Yes. So you have chapel veils,
or
right?
Mantillas.
Yes, mantillas sometimes. And so, but I know that, and so that was growing up in Brooklyn, New York, where that there's a lot of catcalling, there's a lot of street talk, as you can imagine. Right. I remember though being that 14 and 15-year-old and having boys and men, grown men, unfortunately, but they would say something like, "Oh, she's one of those church girls," if I was on my way to church and I was dressed in this way. And so the idea, and absolutely the sexism, the patriarchy, and all of that is just absolutely there. I wouldn't even deny it. But I also heard something different, which is that I was marked. Somebody cared about me. There's a community behind me. They knew where that, very loud holiness church that met on Tuesdays and Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays, 4 days a week, with loud music. We know where she's going, and we know that somebody's looking out for that girl, right? And in a world in which men are particularly predatory toward girls that they think don't have a community, a family, a protection, right? It was clear that I was being marked. And while I chafed against that and just thought this is just insane, and I can't wait till I go to college and I will never put a doily on my head again, and that's true, and I will never, I wore the shortest skirts imaginable, until I got older and then decided like, oh, perhaps it's time to put those away for other reasons. But that there's something that stayed with me about having the protection of a community, having these folks know that I encountered, there's somebody who loves this little girl, and they're going to watch out for her, and they're going to protect her. And that was really powerful. The second piece I wrote about, which was about, it's thinking about secrets and shame. So unfortunately, these were older women, my church mothers, a lot of secrets, a lot of shame for them about abuse, rape, stigmas of pregnancies, and you know the story. So I don't have, but because of that stigma and that shame, they also, I think, had a very keen sense of the predatory, right? And one of the things I do say in the book, that they were trying to protect me, not just from the boys and the men and the predators outside the church, the wolves outside the church, but the ones that we know exist within the church. I couldn't have understood that as a kid, that maybe that person wasn't harmless, right? You just go where you go, because there were predators, there were wolves inside the house and those outside the house. They don't have the language that I feel like I have to tell my daughter about those things. As a mother, I do talk to my daughter about those things, and I talk very frank and forthrightly about those things. They didn't quite have that language. They had a lot of church and religious language, but there were predators inside the church. And I think they had a highly intuitive, developed sense of how do we protect this next generation of girls from these predators. This is not about, authorizing their methods. It's just saying, I think the story is a very complicated one.
I do too. And I really appreciate your shedding light on it for us. I want to just quote, I alluded to this in my introduction, that there's a wonderful afterword to this book, and it's called Afterword by a Daughter. And I don't mean to say that the afterword is worth the price of the book, but don't miss it. It's and I'll just read the last line. It's written by your daughter, and she says, she'll tell them what I could never express about a mother's love, and I hope they will listen. What a wonderful line to end your book on, with your daughter saying, I hope they will listen.
Thank you.
Mine just called in the middle of our talk, so I know what you're saying. It's my unhappy task to close our formal time together with the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, but I have 8 more questions on my list, and I'm sure lots of other people do too. Your work on sacramental theology, your interest in Mariology, I mean, some of these things are really amazing. And I just want to bring people's attention to a similar conversation that we had now some years ago with Judith Castleberry, who's the author of The Labor of Faith, Gender and Power in Black Apostolic Pentecostalism. And that's on our website from 2018. And she looked at the Church of Our Lord Jesus Christ of the Apostolic Faith, which is one of the ones that gets looked at, or actually one of the ones that doesn't often get looked at. Isn't that the case in these things? And she talked about the way in which women in that community organized themselves in horizontal groups to cut across the hierarchies of the men. It's a wonderful book. She's a terrific scholar. She's also a great musician.
She is.
Dupre. I mean, those
amazing.
Great musicians. And I recommend her book very highly, Duke University Press. And I recommend that you go to our website and listen to the conversation with Judith Castleberry. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. She's wonderful, phenomenal.
Yeah, she's quite something else. I can't thank you enough, but I'm going to thank you enough by inviting you back. And
Okay.
I'm going to keep the conversation open now for a few minutes after I make the final announcement. So if I may, on behalf of all of us, Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been everything I had hoped. And my friends around on this call will know I do not hype books that are not to be, that don't measure up. And this one goes beyond my my modest words about it. So thank you, and please
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here, and I will say goodbye and go teach my class, but thank you all so much.